South Africa and Nigeria are the two biggest economies in sub-Saharan Africa. This makes the relationship between them important for the advancement of African development both regionally and continentally. Engagement between the countries remains active, but trade and investment is below its potential. Over the years, many efforts have been made to address this issue. The latest of these is the Joint Ministerial Advisory Council on Industry, Trade and Investment, a public-private partnership launched by the two governments and business in 2021. Its mandate is to deepen political and economic engagement. This video is a contribution to the initiative and aims to build a greater understanding of the South African market for Nigerian companies, offering a snapshot of the country's business environment.
Nigeria in West Africa, obviously South Africa on the southern tip. When South Africa and Nigeria are aligned, it becomes easy to pull the different parts of the continent together towards a common agenda. This is going to become increasingly important in the context where Africa is executing on its Agenda 2063, and within that the very ambitious continental free trade agreement. So with the long history that the two countries have diplomatically, economically, the sense one gets is that our current presidents, President Ramaphosa and President Tinubu, are very keen to continue to nurture the relationship between the two countries, build on the foundation that has been laid by their predecessors, take the relationship between the two countries to new heights. The conversations that South Africans and Nigerians are having are the right ones, which are about how to diversify the basket of goods, commodities that South Africa imports from Nigeria, because trade really works well when it's mutually beneficial. And I do think that exchanges in sort of professionals like academics would go a long way towards dispelling some of the perceptions that exist amongst our people between these two countries, going some way in ensuring that we clear the air and lay a basis for deeper relations, people-to-people relations, economic relations, diplomatic relations, and so on and so forth.
The priority sectors that South Africa is looking to attract investors to, the main one, the first one being climate smart agriculture and agro-processing. We're looking to feed the world, and we're mindful that we need to have agricultural processes that are, responsive to the climate change scenario. We're also looking at mining and minerals processing and beneficiation in particular, because the challenge of not having value added to our products is one that we take very seriously. So we're looking for beneficiation of mineral products, and partnerships with other African countries would be highly encouraged. Hydrocarbons and natural gas. Investors that have experience in that area are most welcome. Similarly, manufacturing across the board. We're looking for manufacturing platforms, factories set up in South Africa. We're also looking at digital technologies and ICT. So we want to be at the forefront of the digital revolution, and partnerships with Nigeria and other important countries on the continent, most welcome. Infrastructure, logistics and energy, quite an important one. And of course, consumer goods and services, welcome, whether it's logistics and broadly just FMCG products, and producing them in South Africa is what we are open to. South Africa offers a predictable environment to investing. So our regulations, our policies, even legislation, quite accessible So any investor that wants to come into South Africa would know well in advance what the expectations are in terms of the particular sector that they would want to invest in, the different agencies that have to issue permits, for example. It will be very clear and upfront what is required. Our Department of Home Affairs is currently looking at how to overhaul and how to improve our immigration processes and of course the legislation as well. So we're quite optimistic in terms of how that could then become an enabler as well in facilitating greater investments into the South African economy. South Africa is very, very open to investments from the rest of Africa. In fact, intra-Africa investment is a policy priority of ours. So we look forward to receiving more investment from the rest of the continent. And of course, the same requirements, regulations, rules would apply to an African investor as would apply to any other investor from the rest of the world.
There's no doubt that the South Africa-Nigeria relationship is a strategic one. We do have significant trade in different products across the bilateral corridor, and it has not reached its potential for a number of reasons. And I think we have to look at those to really identify how to move this thing forward. One of those issues is proximity. South Africa and Nigeria are quite far apart. Countries do tend to graduate initially to the countries closest to them, as Nigerian companies have done in Ghana and others, and South Africans in our region as well in Southern Africa. So we have to accept that that is going to be a limitation of sorts. But that said, our trade and investment needs a lot of work, and part of that is to improve the engagement between each other. Economically, the structure of our economies is different. We're at different places in our development, but we have different competitive advantage. What we have to do is find out where is that competitive advantage and how can we exploit it to greater effect. So one of the issues that we do face is a historical kind of legacy of a certain amount of mistrust and of the difficulty of getting to each other's countries. Both countries still insist on visas for each other's nationals, and this adds a layer of cost and complexity to doing business. There's also the issue of what does South Africa need? South Africa's openness to investors is based on a set of sectors in which it's looking for strategic kind of investment and engagement. And I think it's important for any Nigerian investor looking at South Africa to know what those areas are.
The attractiveness of South Africa for Nigerian companies could be classified in a number of areas. One, the obvious one, is the proximity. In terms of other areas where Nigerian companies invest, and at that same standard, South Africa is obviously the closest in terms of distance to Nigeria. There's also the fact that South Africa is a transport hub across the continent. So for any Nigerian company that wants to do more or expand across the continent, there's a very good case to set up shop in South Africa as well. So the key areas where Nigeria could export to South Africa is obviously, the obvious one is oil and gas. Oil, which is the mainstay of what they've been doing in the past, but even more recently, there's a gas need developing in South Africa, which Nigeria particularly can take advantage of. So despite the advantages between the two countries in both directions, unfortunately the number of Nigerian companies invested in South Africa at this point in time are not as much as you would expect. And we at the Chamber expect that that number could grow significantly, and we're more than happy to welcome more Nigerian companies and help facilitate some of these investment initiatives. Also, there is a large pool of investment capital in South Africa compared to the rest of Africa. There is an opportunity for Nigerian companies and Nigerian initiatives to tap into this pool of capital as well and develop the continent.
For South Africa and Nigeria in particular, the problems are not intrinsic to the fact that the trade is between these two countries. The problems are about the ease of doing business when it comes to clearing the goods, making sure that all the relevant legislation, the regulations, and the standards have been cleared properly in each of the countries. And when the goods arrive where in their final destination, also the customs clearance becomes a big issue, because you want to make sure that everything has been crossed properly. Both our central banks are members of the Association of African Central Bank Governors, and that facilitates the rules. So in case we don't have understanding of what a transaction in Nigeria means, the lines of communication between the central banks are very open, and the knowledge of the rules between central banks themselves are very high. So the trust in the system is very high.
When we're looking at visas, we always want to get people into the country as quickly as possible. In South Africa, I think every time when we've looked at Nigerian nationals trying to come to South Africa, we've always understood that there's always, I would say, a number of applications that are submitted, and therefore it takes a long time somehow to have the applications adjudicated. To me, or to us as Fragment, that probably focuses a lot on the number of staff members that are in the consulate or in the embassy in Nigeria. Do we have enough people to try and address that? We looked at other things like your e-visas. Your e-visas, for example, they're there to try and get people moving quickly. It's supposed to be a process that is online, that saves you time. And yet, at this point, this is where I would say is a big issue. They take a long time to be finalized. We still do pick up some issues with some applications that are submitted, where an embassy or a consulate says, I'm sorry, I reached out and I could not get a response, and therefore I could not verify this, and rejects the application on that basis. As to when and how they reached out is concerned, we don't get that info at all, but it is something that I would say brings in an unnecessary pressure on the business travel that is supposed to be easy. The government has always been receptive to some of the ideas that the business world has had, in that they would always ask us for comments when it comes to changes that they want to implement. And they would also reach out to us and to ask if we've got any suggestions on the processes that we currently have. So we, as the business community, has always played a role in this and continues to play a role.
There is a perception in Nigeria that South Africans generally are anti-foreigners, and in South Africa, due to the activities of a number of unscrupulous Nigerians, that they're into drugs and into dodgy religious organizations. Now that is a big challenge, because that is generally fueled by the media, and unfortunately, without that being managed, the impression just continues to go on and on. This definitely doesn't take into account the activities of very many professionals, Nigerians in the medical environment, in academia, and in business, who are doing really, really well. Consistent program that exposes both sides of the divide to the positives of both sides will go a massive way in showing the things that are possible between both countries.